we would like to welcome Dr. Raymond Gilpin, Chief Economist of the UNDP Regional Bureau for Africa, as our guest and have fruitful discussion with students and other participants. So to remark the opening, Professor Aya Suzuki, Graduate School of Frontier Sciences and Special Advisor to the President in charge of Africa Collaboration of the President of University of Tokyo, will give opening remarks. Professor Suzuki, you have the floor.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Hanai, for the kind introduction. Dr. Raymond Gilpin, Ms. Hideko Hajiliach, fellow U-Tokyo students, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Aya Suzuki from the Graduate School of Frontier Sciences. It is my great honor to deliver this opening remark at the UNDP Special Seminar Towards 2030, a Roadmap for Africa's Promise, jointly organized by the United Nations Development Program and the Institute for Future Initiatives, the University of Tokyo. UNDP and the University of Tokyo signed the Comprehensive Partnership Agreement in 2018, and it was done between Dr. Ashim Steiner, the administrator of the UNDP, and Professor Makoto Gonokami, the then president of the University of Tokyo. Then we had lectures by Dr. Steiner and President Gonokami at the same venue as of today. Following, we had several workshops. During this 5 years since the signing of the agreement, the world has changed dramatically. The first thing that probably comes to mind to many people is probably the spread of COVID-19, which started in 2020. As we still remember, the world faced the unprecedented challenge of fighting against the unknown disease and struggling with the new normal to sustain our life. The pandemic also reversed our efforts to fight against poverty. While the poverty rate in the world had been going down, the prospect was high to achieve the SDG goal by 2030. After the pandemic, it seems unlikely that we'll achieve that goal. Second thing is the war in Ukraine, which started in 2022. Since the Russian intrusion, the world seems to be subdivided, and the geopolitics have become more and more important. The effects of the war is also felt all over the world in terms of the rise of oil and food prices and food security. Thirdly, the issues of climate change cannot be dismissed. While our economic activity slowed down during the pandemic, it was not enough to offset the harm that we have had on our environments. While the global collaboration is imperative to tackle those climate change issues, the geopolitics has made it more difficult to achieve the concerted efforts towards the net zero goal. All in all, the world seems to be facing more difficult challenges today. The University of Tokyo launched the U-Tokyo Compass in 2020, which is a guiding principle for the university under the title of Into a Sea of Diversity, Creating the Future Through Dialogue. In this document, we place a great value on embracing diversity within the university, and to do so, promoting dialogue is considered as the essential method. Given the changing world, we are aware that the role of university in the society needs to be reconsidered, and we have been considering and implementing many changes and innovations within the university. As a university to contribute to the global public, we would like to strengthen our collaboration with the countries in the global south. And in this regard, we have actually recently established a working group on Africa under the President Teruo Fuji. We hope to make some tangible contributions in near future. Given this move, this conference is organized in a very timely manner. We hope to hear the visions of the UNDP to tackle these multi-layered challenges faced by Sub-Saharan African countries from Dr. Gilpin, followed by students' interaction with Dr. Gilpin. I hope that through the dialogue, this conference will be fruitful and great learning opportunity for all the audience today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Suzuki. So now I'd like to introduce today's special guest, Dr. Raymond Girbin. Dr. Girbin is Chief Economist and Head of the Strategy Analysis and Research Team at the Regional Bureau for Africa, UNDP. In this capacity, he provides leadership on all matters related to economic analysis, strategy, and research in UNDP's Africa Bureau, and manages the Bureau's network to economists. It is very big honor for us to invite him to their special seminar with the Tokyo student and the general participant. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Girbin.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I'd like to start by expressing my gratitude to the faculty and students of the historic University of Tokyo, and also the Institute for Future Studies. This is a very important time for us to be considering Africa towards 2030. We know, as Professor Suzuki has just pointed out, that the world has changed significantly over the last 2 decades, and particularly so over the last 3 to 4 years. But we don't think it has changed enough for the African continent. In 2015, the International Commons came together and agreed on Sustainable Development Goals, 17 of them, that were supposed to be a pathway to lift millions out of poverty, to ensure resilience, not just economically, but also in societies, and to ensure broadly across the world that no one is left behind. This year is an auspicious year for us to be having this conversation about towards 2030, because we are midway, halfway through on our way to the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's like you are in a football match and you finish the first half and you go in during halftime and the manager has a chat with his team. What did you do well during the first half? What could you do better to ensure that you win the game? Africa is at that point right now. And as we look back on the past 8 years, and we look forward to the next 7 years, we have to ask ourselves the question, what do we need to do differently that would ensure that the goals that we all enshrined in 2015 as the Sustainable Development Goals, that we could actually make some progress towards attaining them? The 4 things I think should help set the tone for this conversation. The first is, we say we're looking at a roadmap towards Africa's promise. Quite often, when we view the African continent and the 54 countries contained in the continent, and the 1.4 billion Africans who live on the continent, we view it from a perspective of what are the problems we want to solve. And I think that as we have this conversation looking at the next 7 years, what we should be guided by is what is the promise we want to capitalize on? because Africa is, many people call it the continent of the future. Huge resource endowment. The Sahelian part of Africa has 60% of the world's solar power potential. Africa and African countries are replete with mineral wealth. 40% of the unutilized arable land on the planet is on the African continent. Africa's waterways and maritime environment have sufficient maritime wealth to feed the world. Yet, we are where we are. And so looking at how we could use Africans' resources to finance Africa's own development, I think should be the first promised lens that we look at. The second thing we have to look at is, how do we do this within a global context? Because Africa is not an isolated entity. It is part of the global environment, a global ecosystem. What sort of partnerships, multilateral, bilateral, and commercial, are necessary to ensure that the resource endowment actually benefits the continent? We have a lot of studies that have shown about how much of that resource endowment gets lost because of weak governance, gets lost because of corruption. According to UNCTAD, about $90 billion a year. So how do we then have partnerships that ensure that the right institutional frameworks, accountability and transparency are all in place to ensure that this future promise is something that is realized? The third is the reality that Africa's development aspirations and its approach to climate change are intertwined. You can't have one without the other. 20, 30 years ago, we didn't discuss development globally or development in Africa in this context. But now we have to, because we see that climate change is affecting Africa disproportionately. And if we do not do what needs to be done to address climate change, we're going to see even more catastrophic effects across the continent. Parts of Africa that used to have droughts once every 10, 20 years are now having droughts once every 3 years. A lot of coastal Africa is challenged by the threat of rising sea levels. Desertification is moving at an alarming pace across West Africa and parts of Southern Africa. And so the reality of sustainable transitions in Africa is not something that is just an academic conversation. It's an existential reality for people on the continent. And fourth, we have to ensure that in doing all of these things, I knew I was going to hit it. In doing all of these things, we don't leave anyone behind, because that is the only way that we're going to really make progress moving towards 2030. Next slide, please. So, where are we now? Now we're at a point, thank you. Now we're at a point when we are beginning to gather ourselves as the dust settles post-pandemic. The pandemic was very disruptive on the African continent. It disrupted trade. It disrupted economic performance. And it also made it a lot more difficult for many societies to be resilient. The war in Ukraine also further affected trade, but more importantly, undermined food sovereignty for many African countries. It also brought into question Africa's place in global value chains, as value chain disruptions as far as East Asia meant that many African countries had to make very desperate attempts to secure food and fuel supplies because of those disruptions. We also see global inflation being imported into Africa. We see threats to multilateralism globally. And we also see declining state-society trust. All of that is against the context of an Africa that is one of significant promise. We have increasing democratization, as the graph in the top left corner shows. We see countries are moving away from what a lot of political science literature used to describe as the politics of big men to more democratization. We are seeing regional synergies becoming more important. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area arrangement promises to double the size of the African market from 1.3 trillion currently to 2.2 trillion by 2030. We're seeing Africa's steady economic growth over the last 2 decades. The COVID years were an aberration, but we do believe that, and most forecasts are showing that Africa is going to bounce back. We also see the continent being less dependent on overseas development assistance and more leaning towards foreign direct investment and remittance flows. All of these are the positives that underpin the Africa of today. Next slide, please. But what is the Africa of tomorrow? Because that is what concerns us. How do we ensure that we have significant investments, not just in the Africa of the opportunities of today, but what Africa of tomorrow is going to look like? I'd like you to just take a moment with me and imagine an Africa where the population increases from 1.4 billion today to about 2.5 billion by 2050. 1 in 4 people on the planet will be African. What will that mean in terms of the resource allocation? What will that mean in terms of the way that we understand poverty? What will that mean in terms of the labor force? Africa is the fastest urbanizing continent on the planet. So when you think about poverty and you think about people in a village, our challenge is not going to be the villages. It's going to be the big cities, the mega cities that are going to proliferate on the continent. What about an Africa contending with climate change? How are we going to deal with that? And what is technology going to do as a potential transformer, but also as a potential spoiler? How do we understand the rebuilding of state-society relations such that violent extremism ceases to pop up across the African continent from time to time, such that violent, unconstitutional changes of government are a thing of the past? That is the Africa of tomorrow that we are looking at. And we look back at the promise because we know that there are a number of things that we need to do to get ready for 2030. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so at UNDP, we actually paid some attention to this, and we asked ourselves, okay, so how do we, as a development organization, think through development unusual, not development as the usual. We thought that we're going to start by thinking about how do we invest our time and our financial and human resources. And we believe that three things that we could contribute: knowledge products, policy advice, and human capital development. Then we asked ourselves, what should we then aim for? We wanted to aim for the Africa that we envisage in 2030, and we thought that we should then take a combination of our programming, our tools and technology, plus strategic partnerships to help African countries be better positioned, not just within the continent, but in the global context. Next slide, please. Next slide. And here is our theory of change, which I hope would tie this all together for all of us. The theory of change basically says that if we start by looking at Africa and the promise that it presents, we, as a UNDP and partners, including all of you, could then invest strategically in 6 areas, which we call 6 impact areas. These are not the only things that we need to invest in Africa, but we think that these are areas that are particularly transformative for Africa. And these are structural economic transformation, natural resource governance, climate change, affordable and sustainable energy, women and youth empowerment, and peace and security. We want to focus on these things. And we want to focus on these things with the knowledge that there are a number of cross-cutting issues that we also need to underpin these 6 things. And we're talking about governance, technology, and development financing. We also then realize that doing things the way we have always done them for the longest time is not going to yield any different results. So we have to change our approach. And therefore, we have our 3 directions of change. Regional integration, strategic communications, and development intelligence. And we can discuss these later. And we think that if we do this in partnership with multilateral, bilateral, and private sector partners and community organizations, we would be able to make the kind of transformation that would enable Africa not just to bounce back from COVID and Ukraine, but to get back on a path to start attaining some of the sustainable development goals. And this is our overarching theory of change, because we believe that adopting promised lands for the African country, for the African continent, is so much better than looking just at the problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Girupi. Thank you so much. And to promote the young participation in the African development, during this visit to Japan, Dr. Girupi wishes to have the dialogue with the student. So today, we invite the 4 students from the University of Tokyo to have the dialogue, the panel talk with Dr. Girupi. So the staff, please, prepare the stage. Yeah, so please, wait a moment to prepare the stage. So the student panelists, please come to the floor. So I'd like to explain the flow of today's panel talk and the Q&A session. First, the four of our students will introduce themselves, and after that, they will ask a question to Dr. Gilpin. And after that, after we get the answer from the Dr. Gilpin, we will have the Q&A session with the floor participants. So if you want to ask some question, please raise your hand. And after the panel talk, so the mic runner will go your place. So I'd like to pass the role of the facilitator to Professor Aya Suzuki. So Suzuki-sensei, if you're ready, please.
Yes, I think, yeah, the microphone's working. Okay, thank you very much. So we'll start the roundtable for the students. Let us start with a self-introduction. Yeah, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. And also, Mr. Gilpin, thank you very much for inspiring presentation. My name is Toshiyuki Sassa. I am a third-year undergraduate student at University of Tokyo, studying international relations. Actually, I'm here on stage on behalf of a student-led organization called Unite, which takes actions to achieve the UN priorities such as SDGs and to promote youth ideas and perspectives into the global agendas and actions, mainly through art and culture. And well, we have about 30 members. And I'm currently involved in several projects, such as the Empower project, which aims to make everyone in society be a supporter using this magenta style logo, through which anyone can show his or her willingness to support other people who need help. And it's an honor to be a part of this session today. Thank you very much.
Okay, hello everyone. So my name is Tapan Relindes. I am a Cameroonian, and today I'm here as a doctorate student at the University of Tokyo, third-year doctorate student. My research, I'm focused on health economics, health financing, and development in Africa. And we're also trying as a group to organize and create an African Student Union at the University of Tokyo. And we hope to be able to revive the association because it was last registered in 2017. So we are trying to see what to do in reviving the association on all matters related to Africa. Currently, before coming to the University of Tokyo, I had a master's degree from my country in health economics, and I got a master's degree here at the University of Tokyo too in international studies before being a PhD student. So my goal is to be able to contribute to the development of Africa, especially revolutionizing the health sector because it's a huge factor for us, especially health financing. So I hope to have a very enriching conversation with Dr. Raymond today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yuna Tamamura. I'm a doctoral student in international studies, and I'm researching on the World Bank and its safeguarding policies, and especially the inspection panel cases. And my research topic is why the requests are continuously submitted, although the World Bank changed it. And revised its safeguard policy again and again, and what the requests reflect the limitation of today's international safeguarding systems. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Naohiro Takehashi, a second-year student at the Graduate School of Public Policy, University of Tokyo. And before entering graduate school, I was working for a private sector for 4 years, mainly involved in the infrastructure project, the overseas investment. I'm interested in the collaboration between private sectors and international organizations, and so I worked as an intern at the UNDP Tokyo office before, and yeah, I'm happy to be a part of this event, and also happy to talk about the next half of the African football game. I'm a keen soccer fan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So, so we asked students to submit questions beforehand. There are so many, but to maximize the time, we are asking each student to raise 2 questions to Dr. Jopin. You can start, Toshiyuki.
Okay, my question is made of following 2 points. And the first one is regarding diversity and inclusion, which is the most important mottos and principles of our organization, Unite. Well, we are working on various projects in order to realize a society where no one is left behind. Probably you've mentioned in your presentation. In the context of economic development in Africa, how can the most marginalized people in society, such as women, children, or people with disabilities, how can they be the active participant in the development project based on the principle of nothing about us without us? And also, do you think goals like diversity and inclusion are compatible with other goals such as poverty reductions and economic growth? I assume you have an experience working on economic development project, so I'd love to hear your opinion about that. And the second question is about the power of youth. As an organization of young people, Unite is we actively brings youth ideas and voices to global goals, sometimes in collaboration with UN agencies such as UNHCR, UNICEF, and UNFPA, and of course UNDP. However, when it comes to the topics like economic development and poverty reduction in Africa, it sounds a bit difficult for us, for young people born and raised in Japan, just like me, to be a part of these agendas. So what power and possibility do you believe in and ask of us in Japanese youth generations? And yeah, that's all for my questions.
2 questions from him. One is diversity and inclusion, and the next one was power of youth. What do you think about it? Can you reply?
No, thank you so much for those questions. I think both of them are spot on and relevant because when you think about the leaving no one behind and inclusion, it's not just a human rights issue. It's an economic and financial reality issue. There have been a number of studies that have shown that when you have full inclusion, including gender inclusion, including and other types of inclusion, but let's take gender in particular, studies have shown that because women are not as integrated in economic reality in many African countries, the GDP is significantly less than it should be. So if we want an Africa with a bigger share of the world's GDP and a bigger resource envelope in terms of productivity, having equality is a no-brainer in terms of development reality. So inclusion is not just a slogan, a nice UN slogan, but for if Africa cannot develop without inclusion. In terms of what we can do, quite often we try to have these special projects or special offices for women and gender affairs. I think those are good, but not sufficient. We also have some countries where we have quotas for women in parliament, for instance. African countries have more women in parliament than most countries worldwide. I live in the United States. There are very few female senators or Congress people relative to the population, but in some African countries, it's almost 50-50. But then if you look a little bit beyond that, and you ask yourselves, how much agency do those women in parliament have? Which committees do they sit on? What decisions are they able to influence? Then you start getting to the serious issues. And so looking at gender representation, it must not just be a box ticking or bean counting exercise. It should be, how do we actually afford women, afford young people, afford marginalized groups the agency to actually make decisions that are meaningful for them. And that's where what I call the development partnership becomes important, because you then have to find ways to include them in the design of projects, in the implementation of programs, and also in ensuring that what has been agreed upon or agreed to actually does materialize. And so that's just a little bit of my thinking on the inclusion. On youth, yes and maybe. Because believe it or not, I was once a youth myself. And the adults of today are the youth of yesterday. And over time, you see a lot of these cycles of activism. And I think that the youth today are in a better position for two reasons. One, they are globally connected. And therefore, in terms of how do the youth today get involved in the big discussions, you may or you may not. But you could get involved with youth on the African continent. They're all on the internet. They're doing amazing things. Do not just learn about African youth from CNN and BBC. Get on Facebook and talk to them and see what businesses they're doing and see what development projects they're interested in and start those relationships. You don't need any UNDP or government program to make that happen. We need to see that being more of the intellectual curiosity of our youth. And the second thing is, I strongly believe that we do need more youth involvement in the policy space. But I don't think it is helpful, whether it is youth or women, and when you have a youth on a panel or a woman on the panel, they're there just to talk about youth issues. No, we want you to also look at some of the complex challenges, like how do we finance green transitions? It's a problem that we are struggling with, because green transitions require patient capital, long-term investments. Most of the financing opportunities available to Africa are short-term financing opportunities. We solve those problems on Wall Street every day, young people like you. So why can't we have young people like you working on solving those complex problems and not just talking about what the youth can or cannot do? So what my thing to the youth is, get down from the bleachers, get on the field, and become participants, elbow your way onto the table, and then, come up with some of the solutions that we need.
Thank you very much. Well, yeah, like on the first point, yeah, I also think that the representation should not be just descriptive, not just the number of seats in the parliament, but like we have to make sure that they are empowered to use their voice. Yeah, thank you very much. And also on the second point, yeah, well, I think a lot of most of Japanese youth generations, we use social media, so we can feel connected to the situation in Africa. Like we sometimes see the post from the news coverage or like the people from Africa. So yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the very encouraging message. Diversity, gender issues, very important in Japan also. So thank you very much. Next, Tapan, please.
Okay, so my first question is related to like the after effects of COVID-19. So, Africa recorded the least number of COVID-19 cases as a continent, and some of the reasons that were reported were like swift government response and resilience that have been built over the years from preparedness and handling other epidemics like Ebola that has been affecting the continent, and overall compliance from the population as well. All of these were accomplished with very minimal foreign aid and remittances, evidencing that the continent can actually thrive if the focus is shifted from dependence on foreign assistance to intra-country dependence. So my question is connected to like your presentation. You talked about we should move from looking at the problem to going towards the future, the promise. So my question is, how can the African governments actually capitalize on the lessons that were learned from this experience, like from the COVID-19 experience, not depending on foreign assistance or foreign aid for its own development? And also, from your perspective, like you were a chief economist when the pandemic started, and someone who experienced the pandemic while also being a chief economist at your current position, what has been the biggest lesson learned so far from this pandemic situation to Africa's own development? So that's my first question. My second question is related to a report I read from UNDP in 2021. It actually said, the projection was that one of the long-term effects of COVID-19 will be a pertinent increase in indirect mortality by 2030, and that is as a consequence of the economic downturn that was driven primarily by communicable diseases. And this is going to affect especially the elderly people and children. And the youth are the future of Africa. We have the youngest population in the world. So my question is that coupled with the existing climate change, the adverse effects of climate change on the continent has been we are recording very adverse effects on the continent. So from your perspective as well, what strategies can African countries incorporate to mitigate these predictions, the death predictions or the mortality predictions by 2020, while also addressing inequalities within these predictions? So those are my two questions. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. I think in many ways, the COVID pandemic was a wake-up call for the African continent. Firstly, in terms of the resilience of its public health structures. Yes, Africa was not as affected by the rest of the world, but it did bear a significant brunt. Public health capacity was weak and crumbled very quickly. We also saw that the ability of African countries and African governments to provide personal protective equipment, PPEs, to access and afford the COVID vaccine was also compromised. And so I think it was a wake-up call that we can't relegate our health sector to a pet project. We need a strategy that focuses on how we have a health sector that actually builds human capacity in terms of particularly health, and that provides primary health care that's also able to respond expeditiously when you have a crisis. And so that was one. The second thing was that the continent was ill-prepared for the economic shocks that followed, both in terms of availability of basic food and fuel, which became scarce after COVID, but also its ability to withstand the macroeconomic shock when productivity declined because of the shutdowns. A lot of African countries went into serious domestic debt and are externally debt stressed because of that. And so again, the issue then becomes how countries ensure that there is an economic management model in place that has some resilience built into it. And that's a second challenge. The third lesson from the COVID experience was that, Africa still needs strategic partnerships. UNDP throughout the African continent, UNDP offices were instrumental in providing PPEs across Africa, facilitating not just the purchase, but also delivery and administration of vaccines, supporting e-governance when countries went into lockdown, providing community services. These were all pandemic realities, and it shows how the international community and institutions like ours could be supportive. But the important thing is that we then don't want to have a situation where there is over-dependence and perpetual dependence. So yes, it is great when there is a shock to have Africa's partners come together. But if the countries then do not make the investments that allow them to be able to stand on their own after 3, 4, 5 years, and then I see it as a problem. And so that is the third lesson from COVID. Quickly on dependency, I do think that the cycles of dependency have not served Africa well. Africa has significant resource endowment. We keep saying this over and over again. But the reality is that if those are managed well, and if Africa could negotiate re-engineering of global value chains so that Africa retains more than 2 to 5% of the value chains in which they participate, whether it is cotton or coffee or coltan or oil, what the countries retain has got to increase. And that only happens if you invest in value added, like manufacturing, like processing, like skilling up the labor force. And so there has to be a plan to do that. And that is when African countries will be able to exit perpetual dependency. But there is a role for aid in Africa's development trajectory, but there also has to be an exit ramp so that now African countries started receiving aid shortly after independence in the 60s. And now here we are 70 years later. It's still a feature. And so that's something that needs to be addressed.
Okay, thank you very much. When I talk about being being self-reliant, during COVID-19, when the pandemic, the shock was all over the world, from some of the researches that were carried out, foreign aid actually went down, but yet the continent still thrived better without aid. So if the continent could thrive without a lot of aid, they received aid, yes, from UNDP and other external partners, but they thrive. So how can the African governments capitalize on that experience where they thrive to improve their economies? So that was my main question.
Yes, I think you're referring to the fact that between 2020 and 2021, foreign assistance to Africa fell from about $53 billion to $35 billion in 2021. And over that same period, African economies overperformed in terms of the GDP recovery after COVID. But it was a marginal overperformance, and it was from a low base. And also, what happened in most African countries is that over that time as well, there was significant domestic borrowing. So countries, governments are in a lot of debt to their people. Because of the significant significant domestic borrowing, domestic interest rates rose, which meant that all the small and medium-scale businesses that had loans, that went up, and those costs were passed on. And we can see that in rising inflation rates across the African countries. So my point is, the countries didn't quite thrive. They just bounced back because it had been 2020 was quite a slump. But the fact that we're now looking forward to a gradual recovery is partly a function of the steps towards improved economic management, improved economic performance, but also more strategic partnerships with external parties, including development assistance providers.
Thank you very much. I think that's all for now.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. Let's go on to Yuna.
My first question is about the strategies in detail for safeguarding, especially when the vulnerable peoples are willing to voice out. So how UNDP staff members are trained or prepared to ensure the capability to voice out when the vulnerable peoples when they have like the risk of to be violated or intimidated to voice out in the consultation. So my second question is about the partnership among the economists and the researchers. So when the development projects are carried out, the measurable problems used in the assessment or feasible studies, and sometimes like that accelerated attitude only focusing on the like making statistics or calculating data or collecting data for like achievements or following manuals, but something that causes the disregard the actual viewpoints from local people. So since lifestyle differ from region to region, and there are like the diverse coexistence with nature and beliefs and emotional ties among them, that not like the unmeasurable things are also essential for local people. Then the question is, how economists and researchers can make a partnership to respect those kind of the unmeasurable things and the dignity of the viewpoints from the local people.
Thank you so much. Really, really excellent points. Development is a multifaceted journey. And as much as economists would like to believe that we could do this on our own, no, we do need to have not just partnerships, but also inputs from those who are going to benefit from or be affected by development policies and programs. This is why UNDP is particularly careful to ensure that not just in the design, but also implementation of development programs across the African continent, we work in multi-sectoral teams. So we have people who understand the societal side of things, people who know how to work with communities to make sure that they're prepared and they're involved. People who understand more than the analyses and the models, but also know how to get the qualitative data. That is very important. And so throughout the continent and I guess throughout the world as well, that is UNDP's model, one of consultation and partnership. Do we get it right 100 times out of 100 times? No. But do we learn each time? Absolutely. And which is why if you take a look at our portfolios, particularly across the African continent, we can see incrementally being a lot more consultative, a lot more community-focused, etc. And so that's an important part of UNDP's model, and it also shows in terms of the impacts of what we do. If you look across the Lake Chad Basin in the Sahelian part of Africa, northern Nigeria, parts of Cameroon, parts of Chad, there was a time when that was a no-go area where violent extremist groups of many complexions, international violent extremists, jihadists were there, really decimated towns and villages. And UNDP, through a stabilization program, was able to work with communities, rebuild not just the physical infrastructure, but to rebuild communal ties and rebuild trust, have reconciliation and reintegration and reinsertion as part of that. Of course, yes, there were economists who were doing models as well, but that when you look at the that project, I think it really shows how bringing all of these parts together can make for a much better, a much more sustainable, and a much more inclusive outcome. We do have some documentation on that shows some of the results, but that is symptomatic of how we do business. Because in the old days, parachuting into a problem, doing a few things, and then going home is why we've gone for like 70 years without a lot of sustainable impact. But we are doing things much differently, and we're doing things much more effectively now. Your first question about how the importance of speaking up and protecting that space, I think that is really important, not just from a societal and development perspective, but also from an activist perspective. There's a huge role for that because, you know, many of the things that need to change economically, politically, societally are difficult. And people need to be brave to stand up, but they also need to feel that somebody's got their back and that they're protected to some extent. And so that's an important part of it. And through our community work and working on No One Left Behind, empowering marginalized groups, we are trying to provide some of that framework to help people who need to voice their opinion, advocate for particular issues, because that's also part of the development process.
Yeah, thank you. And I will do my best to, in order to contribute to have more policies that can achieve the No One Left Behind in each development project. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last one, Naohiro, please.
Yep. Thank you. And I would like to ask two questions about private sector and Japan's contribution to Africa development. And first question, so in recent years, we have seen the emergence of the startups inside Africa and outside Africa. And I understand the situation is changing. Like, before the main players in Africa development was like a big company, like JICA or other construction companies. But right now, like startups are doing very hard, working hard in the development. And okay, so in that situation, from the perspective of a chief economist of UNDP, what do you expect from each players in the Africa's development? Like, in which specific areas do you see the strong need to collaborate with such players, or what type of role do you expect for each player? This is my first question. And as a second question, Japan's contribution. So Japan, together with the United Nations and UNDP, World Bank, and the African Union Commission, is leading a TICAD unit, and boosting development in Africa. And how do you evaluate Japan's contribution for Africa's development? What are the challenge area for the improvement, if any? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think great questions. Your first question about the role of the private sector and startups in Africa, what I see as the role. I see learning as the most important thing. A lot of people, particularly on the African continent, they approach startups as they would approach development projects. If we invest in this startup, we want to see all the startups in 5 years doing well and employing people, and that's not the way startups work. In most countries, including in Israel, which is the world's capital of startups, 80% of first-time startups fail. But then most of the second and third-time attempts succeed. And why that is possible? Because they have a learning ecosystem that helps ensure that the experience is not lost, and that where assistance is needed, where partnerships are needed, you get it done. And on the African continent at the moment, it is remarkable what young African folk are doing. A couple of months ago, I was in, actually not a couple of months, last month, I was in Uganda. And I met this young lady who has a company. And this company started as a way to support refugee women with retail commerce, selling vegetables and fruits at the market. And this lady is an engineering graduate from the university who believes in renewable energy. And after working with this group of market women for a while, she thought, why don't we invent a solar dryer? So the foods don't perish after 2 or 3 days. You can dry them, they will last longer, and they could sell. So she teamed up with some guys, and they invented this solar dryer. And I talked to some of the women in the market. Their turnover increased 40% because of that. And the groups started to grow. And after a while, they thought, the groups are growing, but how do we expand our markets? So they developed an app, and they converted gasoline motorbikes to solar motorbikes, electric motorbikes, solar-powered electric motorbikes to deliver. And now they have a whole ecosystem. Started with one young person with a dream and commitment. I think we need to see more of that. But I was looking at the bike. I'm not an engineer of any sort. I don't know. I know my limitations in life. But I saw that the design was a little wonky, the battery was a little big, and I'm thinking, if there is some University of Tokyo engineer who can say, we can do that better, partner with her. That is making direct an impact in the lives and the livelihoods of so many people. You don't have nowhere where it would go. So learning about, what is going on there and how you could integrate. It's not every time that you will have the good idea from the outside. There might be a great idea that you could make better, or that you could expand, or you could say, oh, if you're packaging that thing, maybe we could sell it at the U-Tokyo co-op and negotiate a way for it to come. And you're expanding the market for it. And so I think the first thing on the private sector is, how do we learn? And then once we find out, what we need to learn, then how do we bring this into fruition in a way that is a win-win? And your second question was about
Japan's contribution.
Japan's contribution, yes. UNDP is a co-organizer of the Tokyo International Conference on African Development, supporting Japan, but co-organizing in partnership with the African Union Commission, with the World Bank, and also the UN Office of the Special Advisor on African Affairs. As you know, this is the 30th anniversary of TICAD. A lot of great things have been done, and particularly focusing on three pillars: the economy, society, and peace and security. And again, after 30 years is a whole generation. After 30 years, you're grown up, you have your university degree, and now you're looking at what next. And I think the what next for TICAD has got to be how to energize people like yourself, so that when you're thinking about TICAD as a partnership, it's not just a partnership from a public sector perspective, but a partnership from a private sector perspective, connecting those synapses. But the second thing that TICAD, and you go back to TICAD, the beginning of TICAD was after the UNDP's 1994 Human Development Report that focused on human security. And part of it was, how do we create a platform that, makes these partnerships stronger? But secondly, how do we create a platform where we could co-imagine a world where Japan and the continent of Africa have a more synergistic relationship? And that platform is a place where we need your voices as well, to challenge assumptions, to come up with new ways to think about the private sector, to think about inclusion, to think about sustainability, to think about how we reimagine labor markets transitions, to think about regional integration. We need powerhouses like University of Tokyo, Institute for Futures Initiatives, to come up with some of these ideas to challenge us, because that is, to my mind, is what makes TICAD a very important platform for Africa's development.
Thank you. Thank you for very informative and insightful answers. Learning is, I agree. So I keep learning in my case, And TICAD is 30 years old. I'm 28 years old, so very close to TICAD and me. So I keep watching what TICAD's playing for. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have time for floor discussion? We do? Okay. Okay, so 15 minutes? Okay, all right. Just one comment about, the startups. And it was the first time for me to hear someone relating private sector with learning, so I thought it's really great insight, And then, as I said, we've developed this African working group within UTokyo. We are planning to provide environment for students to get involved in this kind of real problem in the global South Africa. So I hope the students who are in this room, maybe if you're interested, please stay tuned. We'll be giving information as we develop. So, okay. So yeah, thank you very much. And we would like to invite questions from the floor. If you have a question, anything, yeah, please. I think somebody has microphone, yes. Maybe please identify yourself first and ask questions.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Danilo. I'm a PhD student from Kobe University. And I'd like to ask about the media and the news coverage that they usually focus on negative events like disasters or disease. But as you said, that we should focus on the promises and the good experiences. So does UNDP have any initiative or is it working with the news or media companies and organizations to maybe change their perspective on how to disseminate the good practices that we are facing today? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. As far as the media is concerned and its portrayal of not just Africa, but the world as a whole, I currently work and live in New York City. And if you watch the news, you would think that every day people are being shot on the streets of New York, or hijacked or kidnapped, or that people are rolling with drugs every day. That's what you see in the news from New York every day. Or that politicians are being taken to court. But no, that's not the day-to-day reality. And how do we know that? We know that because we are sophisticated consumers of information, and we could take information from multiple data points and say, no, really, New York is not that cesspool that we are seeing on the news. I think that same approach we should apply to Africa. And we should, at least now with the internet, like about 2 or 3 years ago, was in a group of people who were working in Africa. Some had never been to Africa before, and they were preparing to go. And so I said, "You've never been? No." I said, "Okay, let's look at Google Maps, and I'll show you my house in." And the person was like, "Is that a swimming pool?" Because in their minds, you shouldn't have that in Africa. So we should be sophisticated consumers and know that, yes, there's huge gaps in terms of development, but no, people are not living in huts. Animals don't roam the streets, and so that we are better prepared to be as constructive as we can. The media itself is not going to change. Good news doesn't sell newspapers or get clicks. It's the bad news. But then social media is amazing. You could actually go and see what is actually happening in countries. And you have enough people from the continent around to say, "Why could I join your WhatsApp group, or could I friend you on Facebook?" Is that a thing? I don't know. I don't have Facebook, so find a way to get to learn, because there are more data points now than ever before, and I think that is something that would better prepare us and better educate ourselves.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Is there any other question? Yes, please. The lady here, please.
Hello, thank you for your lecture. My name is Miyu Takazawa, a junior student studying international politics at the University of Tokyo. So, while the development of Africa as a region as a whole is important, I think it is necessary to work in correcting the disparities within each country in Africa in order to maintain peace and sustainable development. However, as economic growth accelerates with expansion of foreign countries in Africa, I think it is expected that the disparity within the country will widen even further than it is now. So I would like to hear your opinion as policies to rectify domestic disparities. Thank you.
Yes, there is a lot of domestic inequality. As I said, I live and work in New York, and I live in a part of New York called Midtown, which is much different from downtown. That's where Wall Street is. And even though I'm reasonably comfortable, I'm nowhere near the people who live in and around Wall Street. But if you move further north, you find people who are in very indigent circumstances. So the challenge to bridge global inequalities is one that continues to challenge us. One of the things that we try to do at UNDP, particularly since we are seized with this leaving no one behind, is to make sure that we are working with governments to make some of the critical investments in health, in education, in opportunity that would lift as many people above the poverty line, and so that the gap between those who have and those who do not have is reduced. And there's a very important economic reason for that, because if most of your population is below the poverty line, then you say, I want to industrialize and you produce things. Who's going to buy it if everybody is poor? And so there is an economic policy imperative to ensure that we close that gap. And we're actually working hard to do that.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
There was another question back there, the lady.
Thank you very much for your inspiring conversations. And I'm Yurika Yanagida, undergraduate student from University of Tokyo studying cultural anthropology. And I would like to ask about the relationships between UNDP programs and local culture and traditional aspect. I guess sometimes traditional thought or local cultural behavior of people in the field prevent UNDP programs from conducting well, because sometimes traditional thought about health or economic doesn't match the capitalism or health science. So I'd like to ask about how does UNDP programs negotiate the local people to local people or local customs?
Thank you very much. One of the things that makes UNDP unique is that we have country offices in all African countries. So when we are thinking through our country program, and our country programs into something we call when we are thinking through our country programs, we ensure that we work with local communities, and we ensure that we consult with a broad array, and most of our staff are from the country, so that we do get that input, because you're absolutely right. Cultural differences could affect what we emphasize and what we can do in certain settings. But we are always mindful and humble enough to accept that we don't have all the answers. We can't just parachute into a country and say, oh, we have a program that worked in Nigeria, so here we are in Gabon, come let's do it. No, we have to start from scratch. And that consultation and the humility with which we approach the development question sets us up in a good way to be more responsive to the cultural differences.
Thank you very much. Okay, there's another question back there.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. My name is Abigail Kiprop, and I'm from Kenya. I'm a student here at the University of Tokyo taking agricultural economics. We thank you so much for this opportunity because it is enabling us to have a very good conversation and view our opinions. And my question is, most of the time it's about aid. And most of the time, every person is like, let's go to Africa to help Africa. And Africa is perceived as a place where everybody is just as victim of events. And we are not capable of standing on our own feet. And how does UNDP, I understand that you're enabling policies, partnership, and all those things. How do you help the African people to feel as though they have the capacity to stand on their own and not just depend on aid, on financial help, and be branded as their own, not just as a victim or patients to be helped? Thank you. Because that really crowds the mind of the people and creates dependence instead of like self-reliance and other things that enable them to develop themselves. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. And I like the analogy that you chose, that, you know, it makes you feel like a patient. But this is a patient that's been on life support for 65 years. And it has to end at some point. You know, very seriously and with all humility, I don't think that that is something that UNDP can or should do. I think that that is something that African people and African countries have to do for themselves. To take a look, let me just give an example. There is a professor here from DR Congo. 4 months ago in the United States, I was listening to the radio and I heard that the government has set a target. By 2040, at least 50% of all the vehicles, all new vehicles on American streets will be electric. 50%. And so I say to myself, where are they going to get all the batteries? Africa has the raw materials. So where are the Congolese youth? Where are the youth from other countries that have these rare earth minerals saying, this is not going to be the same as happened with oil or diamonds or cocoa or coffee. We know that by 2040, they're going to be buying a lot of these things. Why can't we produce them? If we don't have the technology, why can't we start acquiring the technology now? So that by 2030, we are investing in the industries that produce the batteries that the world is going to need, because we have the raw materials. That's how we have value addition. That's how we have, we put ourselves in a position where we make the continent's natural resources work for ourselves. That's how Congo then becomes, all right, well, if Gambia has a problem, Congo will give them aid. That's how we change things, by looking strategically at using what we have to enhance our capability. I don't think UNDP can come in with any silver bullet to address that. I think the African people themselves have to ask the African governments, because this is a no-brainer. You can go on the internet and Google, how do you make a battery? Somebody will Google video, what do you need to do it? How difficult could that be? Why don't we have more African countries doing that? Or taking a look at some of the pristine forests or tourist attractions, and say, how do we make people want to come every year and not just 1 year? What do we need to invest today to make it a memorable experience, that when somebody comes for, a tourist comes on vacation in Kenya, they'll want to tell everybody on their WhatsApp group so that they themselves come. That is how we start doing it. But until we do that, and until we are going to be in this cycle of dependency and feel like that patient that's on life support.
Okay. You okay? All right. I think there was another question in front. 大丈夫ですか? How are we doing with time? Okay, it's time. Okay. So thank you very much, Dr. Jopin, for all the wonderful comments. Very positive, honest, and encouraging replies, to all the youth. And I think a lot of people are really inspired by the comments and discussions. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gilpin, Professor Suzuki, and the student panelists. So now time to close. And on behalf of the student, the Tamamura-san, Ms. Tamamura, present a commemorative gift to the Dr. Gilpin. Doctor, this is a bonbonniere. You know the bonbonniere in French, it means the vessel of happiness. This is a small box for the kind of the candies, but it means to give the happiness. So please, Tamamura-san. Thank you so much. And could you remain in the seat and after? So now we'd like to invite Ms. Hajarich for the closing remark.
Thank you so much. On behalf of United Nations Development Program, I'd like to thank all of you to gather here today, and of course, Professor Hanai and Professor Suzuki for wonderful organization, of course, representatives of students' associations. It was so energetic to have all of you to have an interactive session. It's not a one-way kind of lecture. So Raymond and the colleagues and I are so happy to have this opportunity. We'd like to definitely continue. And I was listening to the conversation, and I'd like to mention a couple of things. Number one is that for the first time since 2015, the government of Japan, the cabinet, actually adopted the revised Development Cooperation Charter, which is the highest policy framework to guide the development cooperation in the world. It's not ODA Charter. Before, we used to call ODA Charter. We now call it Development Cooperation Charter. So it's a long document, so I will not go through all the elements, but then something relevant to what we discussed here today. First is that the importance of the co-creation of development solution with developing countries. This approach really resonates with the approach we have IFI and also UNDP, because sometimes the connotation of global south is that as if North is teaching South. It's not that. Like a startups, UNDP always learn. We have a learning loop. We adopt behavioral science. We adopt anticipatory planning. Also, we exercise sense-making, exercise with community members to understand what it means, right? So that's why we have a human security concept, that it's not a big fancy infrastructure that may destroy ecosystem, that may destroy community livelihood, but it's about human security. And the human security is the start point of the planning of any development projects. That's number one. And then number two, under the new Development Cooperation Charter, is the importance of a humanitarian development and peace nexus. What it means is that, yes, humanitarian assistance is very important. It's a reality. The financial requirement in the world is 51 billion US dollars this year. It's important. But as Raymond told us, that we cannot just continue humanitarian assistance. We have to start, well, concurrently with the humanitarian assistance, we have to have a dialogue-based development support. So anyway, I didn't anticipate that the conversation comes to the point of a new Development Cooperation Charter of Japan. And I look forward to further collaboration, and then I look forward to learning from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Director Hajarit. And then thank you very much for all the participants that today you come the venue despite of this the hot weather. And I think that even in the University of Tokyo, the discussion on the African issue is not so major, but I believe the people who came here have the strong interest or very interested in this topic, and in the future, some student can be the practitioner or researcher in the African issue. I know that some of the UNDP members, they are studying in the University of Tokyo and becoming the UNDP staff and come here. So that I feel very glad to have this opportunity with you. And you want to check the detail, or you want to see the presentation slides or the video. IFI and the UNDP will upload the video and the PowerPoint presentation on the website. So please check again. And if you want to share someone, please do that on the SNS or something. Thank you so much. So thank you very much. So please give the big hand to the panelists and participants. Thank you very much. So now we'd like to take the group photo for the panelists. Yeah, please. Thank you, participants. ありがとうございました。